All right. Thank you all so much for being here today at our 8th Trilateral Forum, focusing on U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral relations. This program is back for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're very excited that we were able to bring a group of students, our student leaders from our 3 student conferences to Washington, D.C. for about a week, culminating in this program. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bahia Simons Lane, and I am the Executive Director of International Student Conferences. We are a nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C. We run 3 flagship programs: the Japan America Student Conference since 1934, the Korea America Student Conference since 2008, and the China America Student Conference since 2020. Our programs are all premised on the belief that students are not just passive observers in international diplomacy, but they are active participants. And our programs focus on supporting the next generation leadership for future peace and harmony throughout the world, and specifically in U.S. Asia relations. Today, we are very excited that this program has been brought to you in collaboration with the Korea Foundation USA and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, who have generously supported funding to today's event. This program also would not be possible without the funders of our Trilateral Forum, which is the week-long program that brings together the students prior to this event to learn about trilateral relations. And so we would like to also thank the U.S. Japan Foundation, the Korea Foundation, and the Japan Foundation for funding that program as well. Now, I would like to not talk too long, so I'm going to turn things over to Director Bae from Korea Foundation to make some opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bae, as introduced from Korea Foundation USA. I thought it was going to snow today, but it seems good till now. So it is my pleasure to be at the 8th U.S. Japan Korea Trilateral Symposium. And I believe I met a lot of you here today about 12 hours ago, yesterday. So meeting with students is always a delight. And congratulations to every one of you on embarking this wonderful program, where you will not only enhance your knowledge on U.S., Japan, and Korea, but also build memories and friendship that will last forever. Taking this opportunity, please allow me to briefly introduce about the activities of Korea Foundation. So since our establishment in 1991, we have conducted a diverse array of international exchange programs around the world, including academic and cultural exchange programs and Korean studies program, here in U.S. and abroad. Currently, the world is confronting the kind of polycrisis that comes from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and ongoing warfare with Israel and Hamas. North Korea's unyielding nuclear and missile provocations and threats amid global economic difficulties, globalization and multilateralism seems gradually fading away, but instead minimalism and plurilateralism are showing up. So in these times, collaboration among trustworthy partners are becoming more crucial, and United States, Japan, and Korea stand firm together as strong partners, sharing common values and exchanging ideas. Recent U.S.-Japan-Korea Trilateral Summit at Camp David in August last year has opened a new horizon of trilateral collaboration, and our relationship has become stronger than ever, demonstrating resilience in overcoming regional and global challenges together. And it is evident that our collaboration will continue to broaden. So, dear participants here today, and especially the students coming from U.S., Japan, and Korea, again, I congratulate you all for being chosen for this program. You have worked long and hard to be with us today, and I personally thank you for your endeavors. Throughout the program, you will get to strengthen your knowledge, build relationships, and enrich your experiences that will empower you as next generation of leaders for brighter U.S.-Japan Korea relations. On that note, I look forward to seeing intense discussions and vigorous exchange of ideas. We have fantastic, wonderful speakers here. They are hard to meet even when you're in DC. So thank you very much for ISC making this possible. So in closing, I would like to express my deep gratitude to ISC for organizing this program, and to our invited speakers. I pass my best wishes to all participants here today, and Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Bai. Now we would like to welcome Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, to make some opening remarks.
Good morning and ohayo gozaimasu. I'm really sad, honestly, that it didn't snow. I've been missing snow, but I'm glad actually really it missed us today so that we could all come together. I do remember Trilateral when there was a lot of snow one year, and ISC powered through and had the Trilateral despite all the snow. As Bahia mentioned, I'm Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works to deepen ties between the US and Japan. And we work mostly within security and diplomacy, and have activities that range from exchanges, dialogue, networking, publications. And as such, it's really important for us to think about the trilateral because it's so important to the stability and peace for the region. Ensuring that the next generation of Americans, Japanese, and Koreans are involved in building an understanding of one another, connecting with one another, and thinking through the challenges and opportunities that are inherent in a trilateral cooperation is of the utmost importance. With that in mind, we're very happy to be hosting this. And I just want to applaud, first of all, Bahia's leadership at ISC for her guidance to the students as they work to put together the Trilateral Forum and today's symposium. And to the panelists, as you mentioned, we have a really great lineup of experts today that you can hear from. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. And lastly, to the students, you are our future, you are the pipeline, and it's just really wonderful that you've dedicated your time and to come to these trilaterals and work on these challenging and I think messy issues at times, but you also see the hope and the light. And we look forward, we meaning the older people in the room, look forward to hearing from all of you about the light that you see and areas you believe a strengthened trilateral cooperation can really take place. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shanti. So we're going to move into our first panel. We will have two panels today. The first panel is giving a much broader historical context on security in the region. And then our second panel is presentations from our student leaders, our student panelists. I'm not sure I explained it fully, but all of our conferences are completely run by university undergraduate and graduate students. And over this past week, they have been putting together a research project to share students' perspectives about the role of education and history in shaping trilateral relations. So we hope you can all stick around for the second panel to hear about that. I would also like to let everyone know that unfortunately one of our panelists, due to a personal health matter, cannot make it today, Sheila Smith, but we still have a really fantastic lineup, and I know we're going to have a great discussion. Now, I'd like to welcome our panelists and moderator up to the front.
Well, wonderful. So, well, first I have to say a thank you again to Bahia and team and ISC and all the wonderful students here. A shout out also and thanks to Korea Foundation and Sasakawa USA. It is a very cold and early morning, and I'm happy to see just how many faces are in the room. We've talked about snow, but it's cold out there. So this was everyone braved it this morning. We have an excellent lineup of speakers. I'm honored to be on a panel with such distinguished individuals who will be talking through their perspectives and experiences, and hopefully shedding a bit of light on the history for this topic. So today we're going to be talking about the history and the context around the trilateral relations between the US, South Korea, and Japan. And it goes without mentioning that the last couple of years have been phenomenal to witness. Over the past 2 years in particular, now we're moving into 2024, we've witnessed a ramping up of diplomatic engagement, particularly between South Korea and Japan, as those relationships efforts are going in many cases, courageous efforts, as have been said. And we've seen a change in public opinion, especially focused on security issues, which in many ways are bringing these countries together. And so, but that goes without saying that this has been a very interesting and unprecedented historic buildup toward what we witnessed last August at Camp David. But it does say that there's some history behind this as well. And there's a lot of history for anyone who studied Korea and Japan in particular, and especially US engagement in the region. So we cannot talk about what will happen in 2024 without also talking about what has happened previously. So what I would like to do with those introductory kind of staging of our panel is first start with a brief introductions of our panelists. But I'll keep it very short because what I would like to do is get into their remarks pretty quickly and then also leave the floor open for questions from the audience. So please think of questions you would like to ask because we'll make sure that there's time for them toward the end. So I think at that point, I will go ahead and just do a brief introduction. So I'll start with the kind of down the line. And so Christopher Johnstone, kind of next to me right here, is a senior advisor for Japan chair at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. And he has over 2 decades, almost 3 decades of experience in government, serving on the National Security Council, focusing on Japan as well as East Asia. And so we're very honored to have your remarks on Japan and to hear your topics broadly on trilateral relations. Dr. Victor Cha, on his right, is a renowned North and South Korea expert, but also focused quite broadly on alliance issues with the US and particularly trilateral. So he is very much the expert in this space and we're looking forward to hearing his remarks as well. So Frank is over at the US Institute for Peace and focuses on East Asia and peace and reconciliation, looking into security as well as diplomatic dynamics in the region. And we're delighted to have his input. And unfortunately, as mentioned, Sheila Smith will not be able to join us for this, but I think we have a brilliant lineup as is, and we'll look forward to hearing some of her remarks in the future. So as mentioned, we are going to start, I believe, with some 5 minutes or a little bit more since we have one panelist missing his remarks. And I'd like to start, Dr. Cha, with your remarks, if that's okay with you, and then we'll come back to Christopher, and then we'll have Frank wrap us up for that.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Kayla, and thanks, Bahia Shanti and Director Bay for this. It's really good to see all the students up bright and early on a Saturday morning. My son, who is home from college, is still in bed. So you deserve a lot of credit for getting up and participating in this. And I really want to echo, I think, the point that Shanti made about how you all really are the future of this relationship. And so I was saying while we were sitting here that when we were students, which was like 100 years ago, yeah, when we didn't even have like photocopy machines back then. We used carbon copy. There weren't programs like this for students. And so something like this, I think, is extremely important. So I hope all of you have been and will continue to take advantage of building these friendships and relationships because they will last you. You will come across these people later in your careers. You're all kind of interested in similar issues, and you will come across each other later in your careers, if not sooner. So on the topic of trilateral relations and history, I would say that we really are at a historic moment right now in the aftermath of Camp David for a number of reasons, but even just in terms of recent history, if you think about a few years ago, these two countries at the leadership level were not talking to each other. They were literally not talking to each other. If diplomacy, a big part of diplomacy is talking to each other, you had 2 of the most important US allies in Asia that were not talking to each other. In addition to that, Korea was about to nationalize Japanese assets because of a Supreme Court ruling with regard to forced labor compensation from World War II. The two militaries were engaging each other in adversarial ways in the waters and in the air around Korea and Japan. South Korea was going to sever an intelligence sharing agreement with the United States and Japan. Japan had South Korea on an export control list, right? This does not sound like a relationship between two countries that have a common ally and that are facing security threats from China and North Korea, the war in Ukraine. At that time, the war in Gaza was not present, but the war in Ukraine and North Korea firing missiles like in every direction, right? This is not the relationship you would expect. And so in that sense, Camp David really was a historic moment, a watershed change. We can talk about the sustainability of this going forward, but an extremely important and historic moment. So I actually, when I think about the history of the relationship, post-war history of the relationship, the other major historical turning point was in June of 1965, when the two governments made the decision to normalize relations. Very unpopular in South Korea, massive demonstrations. It was sort of the equivalent of the security crisis in Japan in 1960, right? I mean, massive demonstrations, but a decision was made by the government at the time to do what they believed was in South Korean interests. And really, that was sort of the start of South Korea's economic miracle, right? That the decision to normalize relations with Japan and the things that followed from that were very important for Korea's development. So that was a historic moment. The early, when was it, 2021 period, was that right around when? That was I think that was a historic low point. And now we are on the brink of really a new era in this trilateral relationship. Chris and I and Frank, we talked to the administration quite often, and they in the last meeting that we were at, they cited a figure that was astounding. They said that since Camp David, there have been 30 trilateral meetings between the United States, Japan, and Korea. Not 3, 30, right? Across all areas, from the leadership level to cyber to every possible issue, right? And that really speaks to how much things have changed in such a short period of time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we'll definitely, if time allows us, our students' questions get into sustainability, especially we talk a little bit into 2024. And that'll be a really important point to come back to, but 30 meetings is impressive. That is something we will definitely keep in mind. So I think next we'll have Chris, if you don't mind going forward.
Like Victor, I think one of the reasons I'm optimistic, I'm actually going to pick up on this. Yeah, I'm an optimist by nature, but my view is that this is potentially enduring. Three reasons that I this time like why this time like. First is that it is the sort of the strategic structural piece related to the international. I think you can make the case that Japan and South Korea and the three of us have more reason to cooperate than ever before, right? The world has changed. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, China's alignment with Moscow and this partnership with no limits, strengthening of Russia DPRK ties. It's a dangerous world out there. It's a pretty dangerous world out there. And I think when Japan and South Korea look at each other, they see a lot more reason to cooperate than ever before. Also, I think, just to be candid about it, I think in the background is also some uncertainty about the United States and the political trajectory here. So those are pretty important kind of structural factors. I think that my point of view seem likely to be lasting.
Concerns about China, certainly a driver for both countries. It's been that way for some time for Japan. I think there's been a change in perspective in South Korea as well. And if you look at the joint statement that was released after the meetings in Camp David, the Spirit of Camp David joint statement, right? It's about 2,000 word statement. They don't mention North Korea until about word 900. They talk about a whole bunch of other stuff first. China, maritime issues, even things like climate resilience in the Mekong Delta. So I think that speaks to this sense that these are countries that have a lot to talk about, a lot of common interests, common perspectives. Second reason why I'm optimistic, more optimistic maybe, is they did it themselves. They, meaning the leaders in South Korea and Japan. The role of the United States was important, and we can talk about that. But it was really the initiative, I think, and particularly President Yoon gets tremendous credit for the political courage to seek to improve relations with Japan. From my point of view, Japan was a little slow at first to respond to the outreach from President Yoon in Seoul. But I think there's been a turn. The leaders have met among these 30 meetings since Camp David. Well, Yoon and Kishida have met 7 times in 2023. They seem to genuinely like each other. These stories of drinking late into the evening in their respective visits. So I think sort of the genuine, connection between these two leaders. As I said, the U.S. role was important, but I think a little different from what we've seen in the past. There was not, I think, I would argue, direct Biden administration involvement in pressing the two sides to improve relations. What the Biden administration did was try to set a context, a political context, establishing this an almost amusing rhythm of trilateral meetings even before Camp David across a whole range of issues that created a habit of dialogue that then made change possible when the political climate at the leader level changed. Last thing I would say is, or last reason I'm optimistic, time and institutionalization. By time, I mean, these are two leaders that I think are likely to be in place for a while. Certainly Yoon, his term extends to 2027, right? Kishida's political standing has become a little more uncertain over the last few weeks, but I think he also is likely to remain in place for a bit. His obvious successors are unlikely to change the trajectory that we're on. There's been clear improvement in public opinion in Japan with respect to South Korea. I realize the picture is less clear in South Korea. And I think the announcements at Camp David and on the margins will help to institutionalize this cooperation, establishment of a regular named military exercise, for example, new forms of information sharing on missile threats, announcements that there's going to be an annual leaders meeting. These are things that are not decisive, but they do make it harder for leaders to walk away in the future. And in that sense, I think some optimism that this is durable. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to the next speaker. This is not the end of history in Japan ROK relations. I think it is. I'm not saying that. There will be issues that test this relationship, right? There will be a Yasukuni visit. There will be textbooks. There will be Takeshima Day in Japan. These things aren't going away. But I do think there's reason to believe that there are some big reasons why Japan, the ROK, and trilaterally, the relationship should be close to deal with the challenges that we face. So that's why I'm more optimistic on the sustainability piece. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you for pulling us back into an optimistic perspective. I know we'll go a little bit deeper as we go into conversation. So Frank, would you please give us your remarks as well?
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to be here. I was actually at the last ISC symposium in January 2020, right before COVID. And so it's great to continue that stream of discussion. 2 warnings. One is I'm not a historian. So for the historians that are in the audience or on the panel, please feel free to correct me for any thing that I get wrong. And the second warning is that I just came back from a family water park vacation yesterday, and so my mind is still in that frame. So I think my views are a little bit less sanguine than my co-panelists, but that's fine. I think will help stimulate some discussion. I want to start off by noting that at the last symposium I spoke at, my organization, USIP, and my colleague, Polly, we sponsored an exercise called a Walk Through History. And we asked each of the country representatives, students, to identify 7 historical events that shaped South Korea-Japan relations, in their opinion, of course, right? I'm not going to go list through all the things that they stated, but they certainly listed a lot of the historical events that we would typically consider. So the 1965 Normalization Treaty, the 2018 South Korean Supreme Court decision, the Comfort Women Agreement in 2015, the Asian Women's Fund in the mid-1990s, things like that. I'm not sure if there were many patterns that I could draw from this single exercise, and this exercise certainly wasn't meant to be representative of all South Korean, US, or Japanese students. But I did find it interesting that the students also tended to highlight more modern cultural factors or events that shaped bilateral relations, things that I wouldn't have considered, maybe because I'm just getting older and older, but they listed, for example, the Girls' Generation album, The Boys being ranked number 22 on the Billboard Heat Seekers list. They listed the South Korean girls band Twice performing on the NHK Kohaku TV series. They listed the foundation, the 2009 foundation of the Korea Creative Content Agency. Of course, that's very helpful, influential in the Korean wave, Hallyu, right? So I think that was very interesting. I think it was also striking that neither the Korean students group or the US students group identified the colonization period in their list of 7 events, right? I found that to be pretty interesting. And I think on the US side, some of it may be because the American education system doesn't focus as much on modern Asian history, which isn't surprising because a lot of US history stems from Western European history, right? So I think if I were to choose additional events that shaped, historical events that shaped bilateral relations, I would have certainly included the Japanese annexation period. I would have also included the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty between Japan and the Allied powers, which excluded Korea from those discussions. And that was, I think, very influential in how future normalization events unfolded. And I think the annexation period is important, not only because of the psychological impact of colonization, but also because the South Korean government and the Japanese government had very different views about this period. So for South Korea, Japanese colonization was an illegal act that required reparations and apologies. But for Japan, the colonization of Korea, while regrettable, was not considered illegal at that time. Many Western powers, including the United States, were also engaging in similar imperialistic activities. So Japan believed that it should not be responsible for providing reparations. And I think this fundamental difference in perspectives is important because it lays the foundation for the ambiguity, the lack of clarity in the treaty and claims agreement that normalized relations between Korea and Japan in 1965. So for Japan, the treaty is very clear and straightforward. That the treaty stated that all claims were completely settled and finally, and Japan paid $500 million in grants and loans as part of the settlement. But on the other hand, South Korean courts have argued that the treaty is unclear about what this $500 million was for and what exact claims were settled. So unlike Japan's post-World War II treaties with other Asian countries like China, Myanmar, and Indonesia, the Korea-Japan Claims Agreement in 1965 does not include the terms reparations or compensation. And in fact, Japanese officials at that time referred to the payment to Korea not as reparations, but they referred to it as economic assistance or congratulatory money for the beginning of a new nation. So essentially, the two governments specifically negotiated that claims agreement to be intentionally vague so that they could tell their own people what they wanted to hear. South Korea could claim that they received reparations from Japan, and Japan could claim that they never, or they did not have to pay reparations, right? I think that the totality of all the legal issues involved are even more complicated than what I presented here in this short time. But the broader point I'm trying to make is that it's precisely because Japan and Korea did not adequately resolve these complicated issues, whether in the 1965 treaties or the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement or the 2023 Improvement in Ties, it's because these issues weren't adequately resolved that the potential exists today for a reemergence of the tensions between South Korea and Japan. So I agree with Chris, the recent improvement in bilateral relations between Korea and Japan and the efforts at institutionalizing stronger bilateral, trilateral ties should be commended. In particular, I think President Yoon deserves a lot of credit. It took a lot of political courage because he went against basically 60% of the public to design a path that Japan found acceptable. But I think the situation is very tenuous and fragile, and I'll give you some examples why. One is President Yoon won the election by the narrowest margin in South Korean history. That's not a mandate at all, right? And he likely would have lost if there was not a third-party progressive candidate that took away some of those votes. And I think if the main Democratic Party candidate won in 2022 or wins in 2027, it's possible that the South Korean Supreme Court enforces judgments in favor of comfort women or the forced labor victims against Japan or Japanese companies. And I'll point to a recent decision. This wasn't 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Last November, a South Korean appellate court ruled against Japan and said Japan had to provide compensation to 16 comfort woman victims. So I think if South Korea were to ever enforce these types of judgments, this would directly challenge not only Japan's interpretation of the 1965 treaty, but also its broader perspective on the colonization period. And I think if this happens, I'm not sure that Japan would maintain its commitments from Camp David to continue participating in trilateral summits or end the bilateral trade war with South Korea. Another risk is if Donald Trump or another quote unquote America First type of candidate who doesn't value alliances wins the US presidential election, then again, it's not clear that this president would maintain the commitments to trilateral cooperation like the annual summit meetings. One last point I'll make is about the ceiling of bilateral South Korea-Japan relations. I think that future-oriented efforts made by the three governments in recent years have allowed the three countries to achieve very important gains and levels of political, economic, and military cooperation. I think this is very significant. But I also wonder whether the focus on political expediency and the inability or unwillingness to resolve some of these fundamental historical issues has hurt the country's ability to optimize or maximize the bilateral relationship. So in other words, could Japan and South Korea achieve an even greater type of partnership? For example, an official military alliance, and not have to rely on the United States as this constant intermediary if they were to if they were able to fundamentally resolve rather than just put a Band-Aid on some of these fundamental complicated issues. So I'll stop my remarks there.
Thank you. I think that was quite helpful to go through not only the history, but you started getting to my next question, which is going to be about 2024, which was excellent. I also want to flag just at the beginning of your remarks, you talked about the generational difference that we're potentially witnessing. And that comes back to everyone here in this room, kind of what is moving forward between Korea and Japan in that perspective. And I think that that is something that this conference has pulled together excellently, as well as all the work that Bahia and team do, bringing generations together. So let's tackle a little bit of what Frank just kind of put on the table, I think in an excellent way, bringing forth the conversation into 2024. So we do have a U.S. presidential election, and we also have South Korea's National Assembly election is set for April, I believe April 10th. And I want to hear a little bit from our other panelists about sustainability and proactiveness. I heard both of those words discussed so far. We talked a little bit about how sustainable is this moving forward, how I think, Chris, you had said it excellently that this has been institutionalized. We can strengthen that moving forward. But there's also, a conversation about domestic interest. And I think in 2023, we saw that proactive leadership and in many ways proactive domestic engagement. And so I'm wondering if there's anything you would like to say on what 2024 might or might not hold. And that could be positives or potential tripping stones as well. Anyone who would like to go first? Chris, go ahead and start us off, and then we'll hear from Victor next.
Yeah, but I guess what I would maybe just to talk about the Japanese domestic dynamic as I see it on this. I think, as I said in my remarks, that I think there was a fair deal, just candidly, a fair deal of skepticism at first about the Yoon administration's outreach and efforts to improve bilateral ties. My sense is that skepticism is largely gone. And that even in the parts of the Japanese political system that tend to be the most skeptical, that there's been a real change in sentiment about this. I also think, as I said, that Japan is entering a period of a little less political certainty about when an election might happen, how much longer current prime minister may continue. First of all, I think he's likely to have a fair amount of runway left. But then also, as I look at the likely successors to Kishida, I don't see any of them as likely to try to reverse this. And I think all of them will continue to see the benefit in close ties with South Korea. And again, that gets back to these structural factors, the reasons why it's in the interest of both Tokyo and Seoul to have closer cooperation. They're stronger when they stand together with respect to China. Of course, with respect to North Korea, they now have this concern about the Russian North Korean nexus. There's just a lot. And then when you introduce issues related to technology and economic competition in China, there's also common ground that Japan and South Korea. So, and I don't want to take it too far, but I think that this momentum will persist through 2024.
So let me make 3 points. The first is, Kayla, you mentioned so our elections here, National Assembly elections in Korea in April, and then before September, a Japanese election for sure, right? Before September, right? I mean, because his term, right? His term is up. Yeah, LDP election. Yeah. So, and broadly speaking, there's a lot of elections in Asia in 2024. I mean, we normally think about, we always talk about sort of the rollback of democracy, but not in Asia. Like there are more people voting for leaders in Asia in 2024 than anywhere else in the world. Like you go down the list: India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Bangladesh. There's a whole host of them. So it's really quite astounding. And that's not something we would have said, a decade ago. Asia was the region that was least willing to accept sort of democratic institutions and values. And there were some people that even wrote articles about how Asians were not culturally fit for democracy. Remember that? Some of you remember that argument, right? Anyway, so on this particular question of the electoral sustainability of trilateral, I'm not pessimistic. Um, in the case of Japan, I do agree. I think while any likely successor to Kishida probably doesn't have the same sort of experience on this issue, right? Kishida was there as foreign minister during the Comfort Women Agreement, you know, and he's been a part of this. His successor probably won't have that. This institutionalization that we keep talking about is extremely important. I mean, if you think about it, before Camp David, anytime there was a trilateral meeting among these three allies in Asia, it was by definition ad hoc. It was by definition ad hoc, with the exception of something called TCOG, the Trilateral Cooperation and Oversight Group, during the Clinton administration, which Bill Perry set up, which was largely for dealing with the North Korean contingency. Outside of that, it's astounding. Our two key allies in Asia, and every trilateral meeting was, but it was ad hoc. It wasn't part of some institutionalized process. Now it is, right? Now it is Camp David. You know, the three leaders will meet like the NATO leaders meet every year, like the G7 leaders meet every year, the three allied leaders will meet every year. And I think it's going to be very difficult for a future leader in any of these three countries to say, like, yeah, I'm not going to the NATO Leaders Summit anymore, right? I'm not going to the U.S. Japan Korea Summit anymore. Very difficult, right? So that's the first point. The second is everybody always asks me about South Korea. What about the elections in South Korea? What if President Yoon loses, his party loses the election in South Korea? And I just remind them that President Yoon did all of this and Camp David while his party was in the minority in the National Assembly. So his party was already in the minority in the National Assembly. His policy was already very unpopular, but he did it anyway, right? And so if he loses, you know, if his party stays in the minority after April, my personal opinion is that I don't think he's going to change his policy, right? I mean, I think he's going to continue to go forward with that. Whenever I say this in Japan, like to people in Japan, they're like, "Oh yeah, I never thought of it that way," right? So, and then, you know, President Trump, obviously biggest wild card. And there I would say he has to have people around him that say, you know, this trilateral thing, Mr. President, this was actually your idea, right? And Biden followed on it, but it's actually your idea. And then he'd be like, oh, it's my idea? Great, let's continue it. So that's the first. So I'm not as pessimistic as most that elections are all going to suddenly disrupt all of this stuff. That's the first point. The second point is, are there imperfections to things like Camp David, even going back to the 1965 Normalization Treaty? You know, are there imperfections in these things? Could they have been done better? Of course, right? Of course they could have been. If we take these agreements and we take them and put them in an academic lab, we can pick them apart. Like I can give you 10 things that were wrong with the 65 Normalization Agreement, 10 things that were wrong with the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. You know, we can do this, right? But the reality is diplomacy is the diplomacy is the art of the possible, right? It's not the art of the perfect. Because rarely in diplomacy do you get the perfect. You never get the perfect in diplomacy, right? And often you are just trying to scratch out the closest thing to something that is good and not bad from diplomacy because of all these cross-cutting pressures. Diplomacy doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It happens in a broader context in which there are many things that make it difficult to achieve everything that you want to achieve, right? So in diplomacy, if you get half of a loaf, that would be great. But more likely you're getting a quarter of a loaf and everybody will criticize you, but that's the best you could get, right? And so, yes, we can be very critical of these agreements and the way they were made, but at the same time, we have to understand that it's, you know, it's not that diplomacy is the art of the possible. It's not the art of the perfect, right? Third point I wanted to make is that history is a construction, right? History is constructed. We choose to look at history the way we want to look at it. We choose to write. The narrative of history is the way certain groups define it and describe it. Look at Korea-China relations today, for example, right? From normalization in, when was normalization? 1992, right, to fairly recently, to about 2016. there was a narrative, a historical narrative about China-Korea relations that talked about Confucian brotherhood, major economic opportunities, did not talk at all about talked about the empire and tributary period as a wonderful thing, right? As a great thing for Korea. Like the Korean War and China's role in the Korean War, not talked about, right? These things were not talked about. 2016, 2017, South Korea puts a THAAD battery on the Korean Peninsula. China uses all this economic coercion against South Korea. Today, if you poll South Koreans, the most disliked country in the world today is not Japan, it's China, 80%, right? So history is constructed. We choose to write and remember history the way we want to, right? And so particularly for younger generation, for you younger generation, it's your choice how you want to think about the history and how you want to think about the road forward, right? It is entirely your choice. But the only thing I'll say is that, and picking up on a point that Chris made, there are real challenges out there, right? There are 2 wars going on in Europe and in the Middle East. Not only is North Korea firing missiles every place, they have this very dangerous relationship with Russia that's now taking place, in which for the first time in DPRK, Soviet or Russian history, North Korea has Russia wrapped around their finger because they need all these munitions for the war in Ukraine. And who knows what the Russians are giving the North Koreans? I mean, we don't know. I mean, the White House releases information about munitions that are going from North Korea to China. 1,000 containers of munitions, right? Shipping containers worth of munitions that are going from North Korea to China. Our satellite imagery, we're looking at the railway crossings between China, between North Korea and Russia. There's a lot of stuff coming in, like similar, like containers. Like I think we counted 700 containers that are coming in from Russia to North Korea. Who knows what's in those containers? Some of it is fuel, some of it is food, right? But military satellite technology, ballistic missile technology, nuclear submarine technology. This is serious stuff, not just for Korea, but also for Japan. And then the last thing I'll say is, again, how you choose to think about history is totally up to you. But the other thing you need to think about is, while you think about that history and how it should be resolved, if you think it can be resolved, or how it should be managed, you also have to deal with this question today and going into the future of, do you want to deal with China alone, or do you want to deal with China with others? Are you better off dealing with China alone, or are you better dealing off with China with others? Right? And I think we know the answer to that question.
Thank you. I think we'll probably get a little bit into the China and North Korea part of the conversation, maybe from our audience member questions, and I do want to leave time for that. I also want to say that, is it possible to get a T-shirt that says diplomacy is the art of the possible? I think we need to tag that and have it quoted, because I think I wrote that down. And
you need the second part where it is diplomacy is the art of the possible, not the perfect. Right?
Okay, yes, excellent. But Frank, I want to get to you before we open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, just a couple comments. I mean, again, I largely agree with Victor and Chris on most points. So I feel like maybe just highlighting the areas of disagreements, but it's not the case. I think we agree largely on many things. I agree with Victor to say that, you know, these historical negotiation documents are not perfect, and it's impossible to be perfect when there's such disagreements and divergences of views. The U.S. Constitution was not perfect. Our founding was not perfect. And that's why President Obama talks about wanting to perfect our union, because it's a constant process, right? So my point is not to just pick at holes in previous ROC Japan documents like the 1965 treaty, but to say that there needs to be a constant effort to try to perfect what imperfections there were in the past, right? Another point I want to make about structural issues. Well, one thing that it's hard for me to really articulate because I'm not a South Korean legal expert, but a structural issue in South Korea is the 2018 Supreme Court decision that requires Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi to provide compensation, right? That Supreme Court decision has not been overturned. What's happened since Yoon got elected was for a lack of a better word, a delay in a decision by the Supreme Court to either liquidate assets or to seize assets, right? It was supposed to happen last August, and then for a variety of sort of administrative reasons, that decision didn't happen. It likely won't happen. Same thing, I pointed out the decision by the South Korean Appellate Court last November that ruled that Japan had to provide compensation to comfort women. It's unclear what's going to happen there. So there's a real question about judicial independence in South Korea if these Supreme Court decisions are not either overruled or there's not some sort of political decision by the National Assembly to make that Supreme Court decision no longer valid, right? So that's another structural issue that needs to be overcome. I've already talked about how the elections could change the political environment very quickly. We thought things were better between South Korea and Japan, and then the Supreme Court decision happened in 2018, and Japan decided to retaliate by putting certain chemicals on an export control list. So it was essentially economic retaliation. That did not need to happen, right? But it did. And there's other sorts of things like that that could happen based on political events that are out of our control. So again, my point in raising that is that, we should be trying to do everything we can to work as alliances, as trilaterally to confront the broader challenges of China, North Korea, Russia. And we can do that in different ways. We can do that by emphasizing, institutionalizing cooperation. And we can also do that by addressing some of the historical grievances that might be able to enhance the bilateral and trilateral relationship to an even greater level, so that we could have things like Japanese liaisons, military liaisons in Korea, or Korean military liaisons in Japan. Or there's another event, a situation that I think is very telling. In recent years, Russian and Chinese flights, military air exercises have been going through the Sea of Japan or the East Sea, and South Korean and Japanese fighter jets have been scrambled to respond to that. And there's been some kind of unfortunate situations where South Korean fighter jets would fire warning shots at the Chinese and Russian jets, and then Japan could complain about that fire extending into Japanese territory. And these sorts of situations should not be happening between Japan and South Korea. They should be coordinating to figure out a way to respond to the Russian and Chinese challenge. And there may be multiple ways about approaching that.
Thank you. I think there's a lot definitely that can still be done in this relationship, and you flagged some of the important areas there. I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A and we stay on track for today's event. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and when you go to ask, please introduce yourself if you have an affiliation, and then ask your question and keep it to a question. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Reyes. I'm an intercultural and international communications major at American University. I'm also a State Department fellow, and my track is public diplomacy. So in line with public diplomacy, one of the biggest topics that we've been talking about in 2023 going into 2024 is reputational security. So my question lies within the realm of political polarization and how that affects reputational security. In many academic texts, we're starting to see how political polarization, particularly in the United States, is affecting the way that we are viewed as a country in other parts of the world. So my question to you is, to what degree does political polarization in Japan and Korea in particular, how does that affect the relationship moving forward? In what ways will the shifting elections cause the relation to perhaps even fracture in 2024? Thank you.
I'll take a second question as well with this.
Hear you. I'm Helen Castillo-Nowatka. I'm a master's student at Georgetown in the major program, and I'm also a JAS alum. And my question is, this was touched on a little bit towards the end of the remarks, but how do you see the future of trilateral trade relations given American tendencies recently towards slightly protectionist policies, for example?
The easiest questions, I think, first, not at all. These were very good questions. Whoever would like to start their remarks first, please feel free.
Maybe I'll start with, maybe I'll take the second one. Because I think the issue you raised is one of the many that I think tried to identify that I think give added impetus for Tokyo and Seoul to work together. First of all, I think you do have to acknowledge that in some of these critical technology sectors, semiconductors, for example, Japanese and Korean firms are competitors. So I don't want to imply at all that there's complete alignment all the time in their interests. But I do think that both countries are focused on this concept of economic security, right? And the downside risks of excessive interdependence with China. Victor noted the economic coercion that South Korea experienced, Japan experienced a version of that in the 2010 timeframe. I think there's also concern about the United States in both countries about the future direction of US trade policy, US economic engagement in the region. I think there's an active debate inside all three of our countries about the boundaries of economic interdependence with China. Nobody wants to decouple. Everyone uses the term de-risk. But what that means, how far it goes, how big is the yard, how high is the fence, to use Jake Sullivan's language. These are issues that we're all wrestling with. The common foundation, I think, is unfettered economic interaction with China is maybe not in our interest in the way we thought it was before. But defining the limits is a common challenge. And so I think, you know, from a Japan and Korea perspective, cooperation in both the managing the economic relationship with China, but also in pushing back on areas of US policy where they disagree. I think there's a lot of policy space there where the two can talk, and I believe there's now a bilateral dialogue on economic security. Yeah. So stop there.
So I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot that Korea and Japan can work together on in the trade and economic space, even though they are natural competitors in certain sectors and areas. One of them is to try to convince the United States to join CPTPP. I think there's not a high likelihood that will happen under this administration, but still they can keep trying. The other and Chris knows this, I'm writing a book now on countering Chinese economic coercion, and for both Korea and Japan, it's not just that and the rare earth cases. If you look at Chinese economic coercion against Japanese and Korean private sector, I mean, China has gone after nearly 500 companies, right? And a lot of them are Japanese and Korean, right? So there is common cause there to certainly try to protect supply chains, but also to think about how you can try to deter or stop Chinese economic coercion without decoupling, right? Because nobody can decouple from China. In certain key supply chains, we will decouple from China, right? Semiconductors being one of them, AI, quantum computing. But in all the rest of them, countries like Japan and Korea have to figure out how they can come together to deter Chinese economic coercion. On polarization, somebody asked a question about polarization. So there's a great new book by our friend Scott Snyder from Council on Foreign Relations, in which he talks about the perils of political polarization in South Korea and how it can impact South Korean equities. And you know, one of the main concerns, I'll talk just about Korea. I don't think it's as polarized in Japan, but one of the main concerns I think in South Korea is the political polarization is really directed at two key U.S. alliance equities, which are the alliance itself and Japan. Right? That is where you see a demonization right, on one side versus the other with regard to the alliance, the U.S. alliance, and with regard not so much on China, not so much on Russia. There's always polarization on DPRK domestically, but the sort of, it's not new, but it has risen to the surface in a way we haven't seen in the past because because it's focusing on the alliance and it's focusing on Japan. And if that comes to the surface in not coordination, but simultaneous to a America first, we don't care about allies policy in the United States, that could spell real trouble. Let me stop.
Thank you. Okay. All right, well, then we have enough time for at least 2 more questions. So gentlemen in the front. I think we'll just have to stand to speak.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I wonder, there's a copy of the Holocaust Museum in Warsaw, and it deals with the uprising against the Nazis and then ultimately Stalin at the end of the war. It is identical to the Holocaust Museum because it was designed by the exact same people. I wonder if a third museum in downtown Seoul, funded largely or in part by the Japanese or the Sasakawa Foundation, might go a long way to conquer the central problem here, which is that Korea feels Japan's mea culpa is not remotely big enough. And so to have such a facility, a scholarly, emotional museum funded by Japan would serve as the ultimate, we screwed up big time. And here we can educate the next generation of Koreans about how this happened. Is that a possibility?
Intense question. We'll take 1 more as well. Just in the back. Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question about the use of the term comfort women. Is there a better term for sex slavery than that? And I also have a question about North Korea. Who owns the land in North Korea? Like at the end of during the U.S. occupation, the Japanese redistributed the land. They made a 10-acre limit. So all the big landowners had to divest and the farmers became overnight middle class. I think the promise of that in North Korea could make them overthrow their government. So is there any look at how to divide the land in North Korea if North Korean government falls, and who technically owns the land there now?
Take those 2 questions. I also want to say that it would be wonderful to have some of our younger voices in the room as well, take advantage of the expertise on this panel. So please, I think we'll have a little bit of time for a couple more questions. And if you're holding one close to your heart, just share with the group so we can hear it as well. Would anybody like to tackle the 2 questions from this side of the room?
So I'll just say on the whole idea, I mean, joint history projects have been things that have been talked about for quite some time between the 2 countries. And I think in principle, they're good things to do, even if they're done not by politicians, of course, but by scholars. But even among scholars, it's difficult, right? Because like when they talked about doing a joint history textbook, like there's no disagreement, right? There is no disagreement that, you get, all right, so these professors all come together, they sit together in a room, they have their coffee and their bagels and they're talking about history, and it's like, okay, 1910, Japan annexed Korea. Do we all agree on that? We all agree on that. Great. Okay. Next question. Why did Japan annex Korea? Right. Then you start, when you get into the why questions, that's when you get historical interpretations. That's when, so this has always been the problem with joint history projects. So, so there could be a history museum funded by Japan in Seoul. That's not the hard part. The hard part is, what do you write in the captions, right? That's really the hard, that always becomes the hard part. Yeah.
Anything else to add?
I mean, I wasn't sure where you're getting with the question about the term, the
terminology for comfort women or sexual slaves, but obviously it's a very sensitive issue, and it particularly came to the forefront when Secretary Clinton emphasized the use of the term sexual slaves, right? And that's something that the Japanese government obviously wasn't comfortable with, but it also was very close to the time where President Obama said that Japan had to face history, right? And so some of these things that the U.S. government has done is not something that the Japanese government is comfortable with, but there's going to be these sort of push and pull periods that are very politically sensitive and need to be dealt with very delicately.
Can I just say one additional thing on this, and apologies to my students who've heard me say it in class, is that, I mean, again, the way we think about history, these are personal choices, these are narratives that we choose to take. But at the same time, though, we have to be conscious of that. We also have to be conscious that we read history through certain cognitive lenses, right? So, for example, you brought up the point about how Obama said Japan needs to face its history, right? And what I immediately thought of was 2015, right? And Abe Shinzo, right, giving a speech at Congress, giving a speech in the Australian Parliament, doing all these things, which arguably some would say Japan on the what was the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, right? Japan is trying to face its history, right? But how that is read or interpreted is very different, right? Because some people look at that and they say, that's Abe just trying to build a legacy. It's not, he doesn't really mean it. It's all superficial, right? It's all situational. It's all situational. It's not dispositional, right? It's not his true feelings. It's not disposition, right? It's all situational, right? These are, and so my point is, history is there. I don't think it is ever resolved because it lives in our heads, right? And how we choose to think about it, how we choose to write about it, how we choose to talk about it, how we choose to receive incoming information is subject to our biases. Like they apologized, they didn't really mean it. The situation made them do it. But if I apologize, I really mean it. Like, it's dispositional. I really mean it. So history can only be managed. It cannot be resolved. It can only be managed. And at any given point in time, in any particular slice of history, there will be different groups that will be using history for whatever purpose, right? There's a great PhD dissertation done by a woman by the name of Catherine Fraser at Northwestern, in which she says that a lot of this has to do with domestic coalitions. And what was it? The media and politicians love to play up history, right? When a historical dispute comes up, they love to play it up. Media because it sells papers, politicians because of the rally around the flag effect. I'm a patriot, right? I'm standing up against whatever, right? But there are also coalitions that don't want history to destroy the relationship, right? They tend to be business, right? Business communities and national security, right? National security communities. They don't want to see the relationship get blown up over this because they have to deal with Chinese economic coercion. They have to deal with North Korean missiles, these sorts of things. So it's a very messy picture. I know it's a very messy picture. For as young folks think about this, it's a very messy picture. But I mean, that's my view on it. I think it never is resolved. We can never resolve it. It always lives in our heads, and in every head it lives differently, and it has to be managed.
Maybe the one, just to build on Victor's great points. One of the things I had the opportunity to be involved with in government was President Obama's visit to Hiroshima. Right, first visit by an American president to Hiroshima since the bombing. And I can't overstate how sensitive that was here, right? And finding the common ground with the Japanese about what was going to happen when President Obama visited Hiroshima, right? There were huge constituencies in Japan that wanted an apology from the president while he's there. There were survivors that wanted to have their chance to say their piece to the American president, right? There were constituencies in Hiroshima that wanted to walk Obama through every display. If you've been to that museum. And so to the great credit of Prime Minister Abe and the teams that we had working on this, we found a common ground, right? That the president's not going to go to Hiroshima and apologize, but he can go and acknowledge that a really terrible thing happened that day, and that it's our common purpose to look forward and make sure it never happens again. Can meet some survivors, but and express that sentiment without turning it into a scolding session, right? And so there's no way that the United States and Japan, our publics, are ever going to completely reconcile our views on the bombing and what it meant, right? But in that case, we found common ground, and we're able to acknowledge this, unspeakable moment, but in a way that after the visit left us stronger. I will never forget the mood in Hiroshima that day. And there was just this sense that President Obama had visited and had acknowledged what had happened, but he didn't apologize. In other words, Japan didn't get everything it wanted. But it was still a positive moment and a way to move forward. And I think that's the spirit that we need across the board on these issues. It's not easy because, fundamentally these things are unreconcilable, but it's possible.
Right. It's possible. That's the key word, the art of the possible.
Yeah, one last point, I'll just to follow up on the point about history is that there's that saying that history is written by the winners, right? And the point in raising it is not to invalidate that perspective, but to say that that is a perspective. And then there are other perspectives, the losers' perspectives, the victims' perspectives, the business perspective, the people's perspective, right? So the point is not to try to resolve history, but to unearth history and study it from all angles so that we have the best understanding of what happened and make sure that we learn the right lessons going forward.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think our time is up, and we do want to make sure to follow the schedule because I know we have another panel today. I just want to say a very large thank you to our panelists. This is not an easy conversation to have. We delved deep. We talked about the past. We talked about the future, and we maintained a level of positivity and optimism in a fantastic way while also paying attention to the truths and the histories that are in the room. So I want to say thank you for this, and I invite our audience to join in a round of applause to our excellent panelists.
All right. Thank you all so much for staying for our second panel, the student panel. Students' perspectives is really at the core of everything that International Student Conferences does. And so I'm very excited that today our student panelists will be able to share with you some of their research and personal perspectives on the role of education in shaping their and their peers' trilateral perspectives. That being said, I have talked enough, and so I would like to turn it over to our student panelists. Each will be speaking for about 5 minutes on a presentation topic that they've been working on over the past week. Following that, I will ask probably 1 or 2 questions, and then we will take questions from the audience for a moderated Q&A. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist. And may I ask all of you that when you're on your first slide, just please introduce yourself before you get into the presentation content. Thank you.
All right, hello, I am Wilson Oliver from the American side of Japan America Student Conference. Currently, I'm a sophomore math major at University of Southern California. Now, of course, I'll be talking about education and trilateral, but specifically the public high school system is what I want to highlight. So the first question is the trilateral even talked about in high school? And the answer is no. And even more troubling is Asia is not addressed at all in American high schools, at least in my experience in talking with other delegates. This is an example of coursework through history through 9th through 12th grade. These are actually the classes I took. And as you can see, there's no Asia at all. you basically have to take these classes, as I'll explain later. So what's the solution here? It's pretty obvious, I think. Just add to the curriculum, put Asia in the curriculum. That's fine. We can force students to learn what we want them to learn. But if we want, these young adults to actually care about trilateral issues, I think maybe we should learn about the students more. In a recent study by Yale and University of Leipzig, students self-reported nationwide, and the first trait they felt when it came to school was tired, second, stressed, third, bored, and only fourth does happiness come into the equation, with less than a quarter of students feeling actually happy. So I don't know if it's realistic to expect these tired, stressed, and bored students to really care about these things that we're forcing them to learn. So if we want to encourage students to take pride in their education and really be interested and passionate about the topics that they're learning in school, I think we should first address what the current incentives for our students are. At least from my experience and the experience of other delegates, number one is always the grade. As long as you have a good grade, usually an A, nothing else matters. So usually you'll just study for a test or do well on an essay, and then once you get an A in the course, all that information just goes out of your brain. None of it matters after that. And all of this is for the university application. Many, if not most, students in high school right now think of those 4 years as just preparation for the university application. And really this is pressure from the students themselves, from peers, and also the ever-present parental pressure. One thing that I want to really highlight as being very important to high school students are AP or advanced placement courses. These courses are run by College Board, which is the body that also administers the SAT college admission exam. And these courses are almost necessary. I would say they're necessary for college entrance, especially into more competitive programs and universities. You basically have to take as many as possible of these top honors classes from freshman year to even have a chance at admission. And also a really other great benefit about these AP courses is transfer credit. So if you do well on an exam that ends the AP course, you can hopefully transfer that credit into college. So it's more economical both in money and in time. Maybe you can graduate a semester early. So in my opinion, changing the monolith that is our education system right now is going to be really difficult for small actors like us, but even for the government, I think the education system in high school is a pretty hard nut to crack, but there are some small changes that are relatively easy and simple to implement right now that I think would sort of change how students and see Asia and educate them about trilateral issues, or at least get them excited about Korea and Japan in the first place. And one of those things, as I highlighted earlier, is more course offerings, especially advanced placement. Now, there's no real AP Asia course or AP Asian history, and I feel like if that were an offering, it wouldn't be too hard to make a course like that, because there are college courses, and advanced placement is basically college level material. If we were to put that into schools, maybe as a alternative to AP European history, that would be a really great incentive. I know a lot of people who would choose AP Asian history over European history, and I think having that option available for high school students would be really great to sort of foster at least learning about Asia, and then we can learn about trilateral after that. Another thing is cultural exposure. If we want people to care about the trilateral, they probably want to care about Korea and Japan first. If they're not interested about Japanese or Korean culture, then I don't see why, an 18-year-old should really care about the trilateral all that much. So these could be culture fairs, or maybe a college club will come and do a booth about their food and games from their culture, and maybe we can offer a small stipend or monetary encouragement maybe for the food costs or for like setting up a booth, and that would be really great for high schools where there's not that much exposure to Korean or Japanese culture. Another thing is, I think it's very difficult for school boards to justify an entire class on trilateral issues, but if we want to sort of introduce them to high school students, having tie-ins to existing courses is a really great way to do that. For example, in my senior year, I took an economy class on economics, and I feel like a good way to introduce trilateral is, of course, as a trilateral strengthens, it has economic impacts in all the three countries, mostly good, but there's some, not as good implications about that. And using the trilateral as a case study and an example for an economics class would be a really great way to have trilateral be part of the curriculum, but without having to create an entirely new course. And of course, at the end, we have to do a little bit of self-promotion. Student conferences, exchange programs are really, really powerful. I think as student delegates, it's been, at least for me, one of the most powerful and life-changing aspects that for young people, meeting and talking to people who are their age is the #1 way to motivate and to inspire people. It's one thing to talk with people from different cultures, but if you're talking to someone who's your age, you can see how different they are from you, but how they're also the same person who has the same anxieties as you about the present, but also the same aspirations for the future. So I think these are just some small first steps we can take if we want to encourage trilateral education in our high schools, at least in America. Thank you.
Okay. So, hello, my name is Grace Smith, and I'm the American Chair for CASC 17 this year. I graduated from the University of Florida in spring 2023 with a bachelor's degree in international studies focusing in Asia. But my journey to where I am right now has been long and quite a confusing one, in my opinion. I thought about what I wanted to talk about, and I landed on the question of, like, how can we facilitate a better understanding of trilateral issues in the younger generation? Since K through 12 education on Asian issues could be harder to implement due to the public education system in America being decentralized and hard to change, I wanted to think of a more immediate way of addressing better education and understanding on trilateral issues. So this starts with university students. This first idea that I came up with is similar to some ideas that Will had, but specifically referring to university courses. So in my life, despite going to an international baccalaureate high school and learning about many places, looking back, I noticed that there was a lack of discussion surrounding Asian topics. So my first experience with an Asian-specific course was taking beginning Korean at the University of Florida, actually at this exact building. So it's a nice bit of my personal history. I actually started out as an exploratory major as well because I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I hadn't found my place in the world. And over the next few years, although concerned with over the next few years, this beginning Korean course contributed to my decision to declare as an Asia-focused international studies major. And then furthermore, through the years, although concerned with the lack of Korea-specific courses at my university, I learned much more about the Indo-Pacific region through courses like Japanese culture, culture and politics in Southeast Asia, and East Asian history since 1600. So although I looked for Korea, I found something that I was even more passionate about and would help further my understanding of Korea in a global stance. In my experience, the background of Indo-Pacific courses in university and through other extracurricular activities helped me to understand U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral issues a lot better and more as a whole than if I had not received this type of instruction. Therefore, I strongly believe that availability of Indo-Pacific courses at the university level is necessary to help the upcoming generation understand these trilateral issues in a more complete way. And again, this picture is a building called Pew Hall on my campus, and this is where staff for the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, as well as Asia-focused professors were located. My second idea was, it applies to more extracurricular opportunities in university, still on campus. Although university may be an easier platform to advocate for increased Asian studies programs, it still can be hard to change the curriculum itself and add more courses. Therefore, I believe that there should be more support directed on campus for Asian interest student organizations. So student-based, student-run, we have passion to do things, and we need support to do those things. This picture is of a club that I helped run called the Korean Language Table at the University of Florida. With support from the Language Learning Center at UF, we were able to run a free club that gathered Korean language learners and provided opportunities for more natural language and cultural apprehension by speaking directly with native Korean speakers. This was a wonderful way to interact with Korean culture for students who could not study abroad or had more of a mild interest in Korea. A similar feeling is felt about the other Asian interest organizations on my campus. I learned a lot by attending various events held by the Korean Undergraduate Student Association, Vietnamese Student Organization, and the Chinese American Student Association, among many, many others. Without funding and support from the university, these student organizations would not be able to aid in educating others about Asian issues and connecting people across the globe in a more personal way. And that's me in the front there. And my last idea is very relevant to today even, but I also believe a focus on funding student-focused experience outside of university, outside of the campus, and outside of regular coursework is incredibly important. So including student conferences like this one, as well as study abroad experiences. This is a way that students are able to experience other cultures in a more profound way. And in most cases, as Will mentioned earlier, students who attend a study abroad or conference, such as the ones funded through international student conferences, tend to have a very memorable experience early on, giving them either a passion or even just more knowledge or respect on Asian and trilateral issues, which is extremely important. I personally was not able to study abroad due to complications with the COVID pandemic, and therefore lost an incredible opportunity to learn and interact at a deeper level with trilateral issues. In the era after COVID, student conferences and external student experiences with trilateral issues is extremely important since it's gaining traction with developments like those at Camp David, for example. If there's any time where it would be important to offer these opportunities and increase these opportunities for students, especially at subsidized costs to make it more accessible to all types of students, it's now. And then just in conclusion, in order to facilitate better understanding of trilateral issues in universities, we will need increased availability of relevant courses, more support on campus for Asian interest student organizations, and more funding for student-focused experience outside of the classroom. Thank you.
So now, oh, can you hear me? Okay. Good morning. My name is Nozomi Miyamoto, from one of the Japanese Executive Committee member of Japan America Student Conference, or JAS. And today I would like to have a presentation regarding Japanese education of U.S. Japan Korea Trilateral. So here is our agenda. And first of all, I'd like to talk about the present day education of trilateral relationship. So first of all, talking with my colleagues, what we realized regarding trilateral was that we were lacking some recognitions of trilateral. So specifically, we didn't really know about trilateral before this program, or we didn't have a strong impression that we have been taught about trilateral at schools, for example, elementary, middle, high school, and university. Most of the education was really focused on bilateral. For example, talking about Japan and US, it will be something before and after World War II. Or maybe talking about Japan and Korea, it will be that would also be about World War II. And Korea and US, that's, for example, relating to Korean War, for example, like US helping South Korea regarding during Korean War. So those kind of bilateral relationships were mostly taught in Japanese education. And we concluded that those kind of trilateral were not reflected in our education due to the inactiveness of concept. So just briefly going back to history, this positive relationship between US, Japan, and Korea was emerged in 1998 when when the Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, or TCOG, was established and came back again in Camp Davis last August. So that's what we concluded. And also I'd like to mention that therefore most of our content of the presentation today will be reflecting of this 1 week of trilateral program. Next is so why trilateral relationship should be taught. So some may say that despite this lack of recognition, it didn't really leave a strong impact to today's security or maybe security among these 3 countries. So some may say that maybe having education may not have a direct impact on the trilateral relationship, but we consider this really important. This is because by recognizing benefit of relations or through education, we can establish our shared understanding towards trilateral, which would, through grassroots activity, which will result in maybe encouraging more trilateral activities among people. So that's why we felt that it might be a little impact. However, still having such education is important when trying to encourage future trilateral cooperation. And personally, I felt it is very important because when I first considered like this trilateral before this program, I was only considering about the security aspect. But after this program, I realized that it is important also in the aspect of economy, energy, and technology as well. Therefore, I felt it is very important to know about this. And also, lastly, regarding sustainability. So I think it was mentioned in the panel discussion as well. However, but when talking about trilateral, it's mostly discussed among like president and prime ministers. However, those powers are probably unstable as they are frequent change in prime ministers and presidents. Therefore, having such grassroots movement is also important and as well. And next, so when we try to implement this education, there are some problems. So first is that fairness needs to be maintained in public education in Japan, meaning so of course history, okay, maybe in the panel discussion it was also mentioned, but history is just one perspective of the fact. So by trying to gain some information from those 3 countries, some may view this as extensive political intervention. Therefore, it doesn't leave a really good impression to the Japanese citizens, and they may consider it as unfair compared to the former history education in Japan. So that's one. Another thing is the slow decision-making process in Japanese government. So in fact, so due to this really slow decision-making process, the education in Japan today is not really caught up to the current IR situations. So we felt trying to implement such trilateral education to Japanese educational system like immediately will be a little bit unrealistic. So that's why we came up with a conclusion of having such opportunities outside of universities. And we said, as we mentioned here, as a support of government and universities, instead of having those educations within those institutions. So as for government, I already mentioned, but there's a slow decision-making process. And as for school, I consider school rather as a place to create a solid basis of education to know about history in the first place. And such outside of school activities as a more like a place opportunity for having a practical and active people-to-people output. So for example, like this program. So that's why we felt in that sense, it can can supplement each other. And that's why we felt maybe having such outside of school education is necessary to Japan today. And other indirect approaches we consider was, for example, study abroad subsidies and trip discounts. So it doesn't have really direct impact to us, but it really helps us to encourage trilateral education among youth. So that's another thing. And lastly, another promotion, but we also so not only ideally, but we also make some actual actions. So what we want to conclude is that JAS 76 can become a trilateral education. So first of all, it's Japan-America Student Conference. So it only includes bilateral relations, but we are planning to visit South Korea as a study program this summer. So that kind of gives another perspective to this bilateral relationship, which results in trilateral. And also this can be a people-to-people personal trilateral experience. So sorry for my really long presentation, but last thing I want to say is that I really felt that people-to-people connection within education was very important, not just to input the information about trilateral as we used to do in Japan due to meritocracy society, but rather like outputting and talking with people to people really helps me to familiarize myself with the country itself, which really may help me to become more aware of this reality today. So that's why I want to emphasize that at the end. And thank you very much for listening.
Hello. Hello, my name is Hyundai Kim, and I'm the Korean chair of CAS 17. I'm a sophomore this year at Seoul National University and majoring in business administration and minoring in political science. As a Korean student panel, I would like to focus my talk around the education of history in Korea and also what I have felt during the conference about the trilateral relationship. So in Korea, we have a centralized education with a nationally approved textbook. The education system is standardized so that no matter what schools you go to or what teachers you meet, the content is taught through a common curriculum. This is very important to Korean students because they're very sensitive about the college entrance exam, which plays a vital role in their lives. And in relation to the education of history, this kind of sparks controversies about whether it is like an ideal way to retell history, because, well, it might give the nation too much power to, generate a national narrative of history, especially since there were periods in Korea where there were dictators who attempted to manipulate the history in favor of themselves. As an example of this is a very recent example. When the former president Park Geun-hye tried to form a national level textbook, and to provide further context in Korea, even though we educate ourselves through like nationally approved textbooks, there are different versions of textbooks, but she tried to make it into one. And as for Park Geun-hye's family background, she was the daughter of the former president Park Chung-hee, who is known for like his great contributions to Korea's economic development, but also was criticized for his leadership and was labeled as a dictator as his tenure was like 12 years long. However, his daughter, Park Geun-hye, attempted to combine the different versions and create like one standard textbook, and the people were worried that she might try to present her father or like the similar dictators in a like positive spotlight only. As you can see, there is always a danger of history being manipulated. And even if it's not intentional, even though history is like really taught in a neutral manner, because of the inevitable selection process, we cannot include everything in the picture. So some of the bias is inherent. And that leads to like limited perspectives on history, which also can lead to its own controversies, but I will conclude at that. And additionally, as one of the most academically competitive nations, in Korea, college entrance is vital and a highly sensitive issue among the people. To be frank, Korean students view education as a mere tool to pass the test and like get good grades and go to good colleges. And to be honest, I wasn't any different until I went to university. So this creates a system where the students do not go over the academic materials they are being tested on and do not really question or have opinionated discussions on the material. And I believe this lack of discussion can be an obstacle to understanding between like different countries, and especially for Koreans with nations like Japan, because simple input without like subjective views or like, various discussions would only make people believe the national narrative itself. And what is worse is that it forces students to view from the lens of the past rather than having a progressive mindset to the future. I don't want to give you a misleading like point that Korea's national narrative is like biased or like solely on the hostile version towards Japan. It is not, but it is true that the lens that of the national narrative views Koreans as victims, only as victims, and Japan as only as aggressors. We do not learn about how Japan feels about the atomic bombing from the US, or we do not really learn about the good relationships we had, well, before the colonization period. But through the conference, I noticed this one important thing that the history education is different in each country. This is like an obvious fact, but very easily ignored. We kind of expect others to have like the same background knowledge, same perspective towards the word. And even if it's like obviously not the case, we like sometimes get frustrated if people do not relate to our pain. So, sorry. And there are certain sensitive issues, especially between Japan and Korea, about the colonization period and also so on. And I was genuinely surprised that students in Japan do not learn to the same extent about the colonization period as we do in Korea. So I think the fact that Korea was a victim and our people in the past experienced brutal pain from the aggressors of Japan, that fact solely does not emotionally isolate the people of Korea from Japan. Although the public sentiment greatly feel the need to stand by the side of the victims and rightfully solve the past issues, however, the fact that the people of Japan have little knowledge on the past and do not really care about the colonization period tend to cause this isolation, even though that might not be, intentional. And for the people of US, since we are in a very close relationship, I think it would be very helpful for the trilateral relationship if US has some historical empathy of the path between Japan and Korea. And also, we should always keep in mind that moving forward is great, but you must not forget about the past. And as Dr. Victor Cha said during the first panel time, it will never be resolved completely. You just have to manage. But I also want to add to that and say that we should not get used to the fact while managing it. We should not slowly neglect some details and be accustomed to it. Lastly, I want to say, in Korea, what can we do? I think we must also understand where Japan and US are coming from. We must understand the fact that in US, there's very little education on Korean history, and in Japan, there can sometimes be different perspectives from how we learn. And also learn how to respond to people who had different historical education. If I had known how to do that and had the chance to actively talk about all of it before the conference, I wouldn't have been so uncomfortable talking about sensitive history issues I was in the first few days of this conference. I'm much better now, but still. I wouldn't, yes. So I think in conclusion, I think it would be very helpful if the perspectives, I think it would be very helpful if the perspectives of our nations, although it is very dangerous to assume that certain perspective is representative of all the people in the nation, I think we should at least learn in our education system, how other people are educated. Yes, and also I want to end this speech saying that throughout my time here with other student conferences, I was lucky enough to learn and gain new perspectives and was honored to be part of this conference and be able to understand each other better. So thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much. I hope you are all as impressed as I am with these presentations. And it's even more impressive when you think about the fact that they really prepared these in 3 days, along with attending a lot of different trilateral programming so that we could develop a deeper understanding among our delegates. I also would like to give major kudos to our Korean and Japanese student for doing this in a language that is not their first language. You guys did amazing. So I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions, but I did want to start with one because I heard a lot of you reference this forum and your experience meeting students from other countries and talking about it. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about your thoughts on how students' personal experiences and interactions with peers from other countries impact your views on U.S.-Japan-Korea trilateral relations.
Like in terms of this conference or just in general?
Either.
Okay.
Grace, why don't you start?
I think that, you know, this is one of the first times that I've interacted with Japanese people in like a deeper sense. So it was very interesting to hear their viewpoints on certain topics. And again, I think one of the things that we learned about in a lot of the programming was like the dynamic between US, Japan, and Korea, and the US sort of stepping back a little bit from the historical perspective, like understanding the history between Japan and Korea and the tensions between Japan and Korea, and being there to like, we want to work with them, but we also have to take a step back sometimes and let them work out stuff before we are able to continue on forward. So I think I saw that a little bit in some of the programming that we had. And we had a programming where we did multilateral talks, and that was a little bit more theatrical in that area, but it also happened a bit in our other programming as well.
Daniel, why don't you go next?
Okay, I think my speech kind of conveyed the answers to Bahia's question. So I just want to say that I was genuinely surprised at the first, like in first few days, like about how we have different historical backgrounds, or like how our education system is totally different, and how our like personal lives are different. So I was very interested in that. So that's why I chose to talk about it in my speech. But I also want to just say that I had such a great time during this conference, like becoming friends with the Japanese people for the first time. It was like my first time to be interacting with them also. So yes.
Thank you. Will.
I mistakenly gave my mic away.
Oh.
Speak a little bit louder.
I think thank you.
I think one of the things we say when we're relating to people who are just in general, or especially outside of our culture, is to practice empathy and try to put ourselves in their shoes and understand their viewpoint. And of course, that's really easy to say in theory, but it's really, really hard in person. And even from the US perspective, which I believe is easier than from Japanese or Korean perspective, it's really hard and requires a lot of effort and trust and comfort among each other, especially when, you know, we only met a week ago, and to be able to be having these really difficult conversations about historical grievances that go back decades, centuries, in a really respectful way just shows how much maturity, I don't want to be saying that about myself, but how much maturity I think the other delegates have in being able to open up and have these conversations. And one thing that we said in the beginning was, if we don't have these conversations right now, right here, then when are we going to have them? Another thing about just having conferences like these is that we always say, or at least in some of my presentations I've said, it's like a college dorm experience where we're all living together, we're in the same rooms, we eat together, we travel together, and sort of having that close of person-to-person connection is really important for developing this sort of relationship. And I don't think it would be possible to, again, open up and have these close of conversations if we weren't having like sharing our lives together for a week. Let's say if this was a conference where we just all meet for 1 or 2 days, I do not think it would be as effective or powerful.
Maybe, okay. For me, frankly speaking, actually like information gained through interactions with other conference members wasn't really surprising to me. So for example, I already knew that each country had a different perspective or understanding about history. So for example, when we did an activity of talking about some events, historical events that really impacted, for example, Japan-Korea U.S. relationship, like it really reflected their like historical view about their country, and it wasn't really surprising to me. But what I felt was really important was that like how we had a more extensive discussion about it. So so those kind of information was gained back in my school in Japan as an input. So I felt like this event really gave me an opportunity to talk about those already known facts that we have and exchange them and have some kind of discussion about it as an output. I felt that was really important to me, as I don't think I can do that in my Japanese high school or middle school. And another thing was that I already mentioned in the presentation, but like I was really surprised how I was really ignorant about this trilateral corporation. So by having such nice friends, that this really facilitated me to familiarize myself with those like issues. And I really wanted to know more about these trilaterals even after this meeting, because I used to only search on web something that is really beneficial to Japan as a country itself. But now I want to know more about like South Korea, United States, and Japan. So yeah, I think that really helped. That was another lesson that I could gain from this trilateral program. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that actually leads me into my next question. And this one's for any of you who want to answer it, and then we'll go to audience questions. But you did mention, Nozomi, searching online and learning information about Japan. So I'm curious about your perspectives on the media's influence and how that intersects with education and in terms of students' perceptions on trilateral relations. And to what extent does media literacy, the ability to analyze media that you're consuming, what role does that play as well in this process of understanding trilateral relations?
Sure, I'll take that from the American college student perspective. I think, especially in the past couple months, the media has been focusing on the conflict in Gaza, and before that, for the past couple years, the war in Ukraine. And really, these big events are not stealing the media spotlight because they deserve coverage and respect. But at least in the student consciousness in where I am, Southern California, the only thing students will talk about is Israel-Palestine. And even if you are politically engaged, which most students honestly don't have the time or mental bandwidth, you have essays and to write and finals to study for, but if you are engaged, you're mostly talking about these conflicts. And so going off media literacy, I think being able to find the stories that are really important, but sort of not hidden, but don't gain as much exposure. Like when I was researching topics for this forum before, I read a bunch of preparation materials provided to us. And one thing that I wasn't aware of was the ongoing conflict and atrocities in Southeast Asia and the river basin. And that's something that receives zero coverage, at least in America, and is not in college students' minds at all.
So regarding media literacy, so I consider media literacy as being capable of gaining much information as possible, or an historical aspect well, it's very hard to, well, first of all, I have to define what to be like neutral when knowing history, but to gain much more perspectives as possible to know about the fact. as media literacy. And I think this is really important, of course, as trilateral. So I think it was mentioned several times in our presentation, but in order to encourage this trilateral cooperation, it's better to have more multi-dimensional understanding about this topic. So in that sense, having higher media literacy results in better trilateral relations. However, I don't think media itself is enough. I think another thing that can supplement such information gained from media is practical experiences. So during this conference, I was considering like one thing. I had one thing in my mind. So before joining this program, I knew about this orchestra established by people from Palestinian and people from Israel. And what they did was that, of course, like before creating this orchestra, they were really hostile about each other. But through music or like soft power, they could become friends as like individuals, and that led to better understanding about each other. And I really could feel that like through this program. So I felt like not only about knowing about the information, but such practical experiences can also fortify this relationship among trilateral.
Thank you so much, Hyunyo.
Yes, I just wanted to like address you the concerns that I have like about the media, and especially the media in Korea. So media, as you will all know, it's like repeatedly said that it's a very dangerous place to be. It's very easily polarized, and like certain hatred is like heated up in the media, and like you only see things that you have like, you only see things that are very similar to your opinions and all that. And like because of those hatred and like polarization, what in Korea did in like the sites, like news sites, they just deleted the comment section, so you cannot put any like reactions to it. So I like, this was one of my personal interests, like, is that the right way to do it? Like, because it is polarized, because it is dangerous, do we just get rid of it? And I think it highly relates to the trilateral relationship, because like the public sentiment towards US and Japan can be hostile, and like, and this trilateral relationship can be controversial in Korea because because of the obvious facts, the historical problem isn't solved yet, but the government is pushing toward the trilateral. And some people think it is a very good idea. Some people think we have to look into the future. We have to be practical, I guess. But some people are very opposed to it. So I think if we have opened up the comment section, there will be a very heated debate about it, but we don't really know it because we don't have the comment section in the like news portal. So yes, that was like, I don't know if I'm answering your question or just like stating my personal opinions or like my thoughts, but yes, that was like, that was how I thought about the media. Yes.
I think that was a very relevant addition. Grace, did you want to add anything? You do not have to. All right, let's open it up to audience questions. Mindy.
My name is Mindy Cutler. I direct a small nonprofit research center that studies Japan and Northeast Asia called Asia Policy Forum. So in other words, for the last 30 years, I've been training interns. So I have a question wrapped around an observation. I am not a big keen fan of class. I never liked history class. I never liked class. And really, I'm really curious how many of you actually read a newspaper every day, who know the news. What you're talking about, where you've really learned, is experiential. And when you read the news every day, you're beginning to hopefully be curious and try to figure out where things fit in and be able to ask more questions, and more questions will lead you to do research. Like everyone was touting how wonderful it was for Abe to speak to the US Congress. Well, if you know some history, that was very carefully manipulated, so it would be April 29th. That's Hirohito's birthday, big triumph for the Abe people. If you watch the Hamas raid into Israel, the first thing that came to my mind was Japan's rampage throughout Asia, particularly because it's most documented is what they call the rape of Manila. And the sexual violence was an obvious. And the next thing that came to me was they probably were on drugs, just like the Japanese soldiers. And the Hamas was on drugs, the same things, the same situation. So you learn from history and you need to beginning to ask questions. And so you cannot also stovepipe history. It's not just Korean history, it's not just Japanese history. But if you look at the history issues, comfort women, the reality is the majority were not Korean. There were white women, there were women throughout, and there were boys and girls throughout the Asia. The forced labor, wherever there was a Korean forced laborer, there was a prisoner of war, likely American or Australian. So the history is broader, bigger, and more complex, but you need to be able to fit it in your contemporary environment. And if you're not reading a newspaper, not getting news sources, history is going to be disconnected.
I'm sorry, Mindy, what was your question?
Are you reading the newspaper?
Are you reading the newspaper? How do you get your news in your respective?
You know what's going on every day.
Grace.
So I don't typically read a paper newspaper, and I don't typically read the newspaper every day, but I am on social media a lot and I follow a lot of different organizations that are reporting on key issues. One that I follow on LinkedIn is the East-West Center, and they post a lot of different research materials. They have teachers there who also write stuff about that, and as well as different Korean newspapers who post Korean news in English. And I think about that and how it into what I've learned in a global sense, and also in
Your congressman. Oh,
no.
that person's making decisions on your life. That ties into knowing the news.
Okay. Oh, thank you, noted. I have political, being aware of your local political government, which is where a lot of decisions are happening, is quite important. But I'm really glad to hear, Grace, that you are getting your news from multiple sources.
It's aggregated. It's consolidated by someone else.
All right. In the interest of time, let's move on. Does anyone else want to weigh in on your engagement with the news in your respective countries? I'm kind of interested for Nozomi and Hyunul, how do you normally consume your news, and how does that affect your kind of understanding of the world around you?
As Grace said, I don't really read news every day. I have my life, but it's not because of lack of time, but more because of the lack of trust in news media. I don't know what to trust, and I don't know what to read, because they say that news media can be biased, they can be polarized, but I don't know how much they're biased and how much they're polarized. So I've always, as a student who wants to know the word in a clear sense, I always wanted to I always wanted a source of media that I can trust, completely. But I don't think I really have that source. So as Grace do, I think when I want to know about certain issues, I read different, I read from different sources, but I don't know even that's enough. So yes, I'm also going on off about my personal opinions, but my thoughts on news media is that we don't know what to trust, and it is getting it's moving from the paper to online, and the situation is getting worse. I think the news media is the title is so provocative, and it doesn't really contain real vital information. So I just wish that we have a certain sources that we can trust. Then maybe I can read news daily.
All right, thank you so much. We're running short on time, so I'm sorry we're not going to get to you two, but we do have a question from the audience. Please go ahead if you could stand up and speak. loudly. The mics are picking it up, but just for the people in this room.
Yeah, that's okay. I was a former teacher in South Korea for 8 years. So my name is Roger Reyes, for those that don't know me. My question is more not to pontificate or anything like that, because I find that asking somebody to read the news is important, but not younger people obviously get information from different sources. So my question to you is in terms of changing the curriculum, because I believe Hyun and Will, you both alluded to the fact that most education systems are still focused on the success sequence. In what ways would you alter the curriculum based on your 4 opinions in your respective countries? What subject would you change and what curriculum would you alter in order to effectively make that change for students to be more well-informed about the world that we're living in, not just in terms of the trilateral relations, but to better prepare our students who are the leaders of tomorrow? In what ways would you empower them to have that curriculum change, and how would you do it?
Excellent question. I'd actually like to start at this end. Nozomi or Will, would one of you like to take this question first?
Well, I don't know whether this will be the answer to your question, but first of all, regarding history education in Japan, there are other pre-existing problems, for example. Especially in elementary school, their curriculum really focus on Japanese history way back compared to like modern history. So that the problem is, so of course, like similar to other countries, they're really focused on grade. So what's it called? They would try to, it's a really fact-based education, or in other words, they try to, they put focus on absorbing more like really specific information as possible, which really slows down the speed of the education that they usually end up right after post-World War II, like in elementary schools, for example. So I think that curriculum itself first need to be changed so that more new information relating to modern history can be involved. So I feel like that's the first step that Japanese education ministry has to take. So that is my answer.
All right, thank you. Will?
I think changing the curriculum just in the history subject is a good idea. And of course that's difficult, and you have to deal with all these issues about what history do you choose, and there's only limited time. Usually you have an hour a day, 5 days a week, and you usually cover only one really large topic. So maybe European history for a year and then American history for a year. One thing that I remember in high school would have been better is if the things we were learning in history class were better coordinated with other subjects. For example, literature. I always wished if that when we were learning about European history, if we could maybe read Aquinas or other European great thinkers and really dissect their work, because history is a narrative told by people looking back at the past. And if you were able to read about people who are actually there and what their thoughts were, I think that just adds more context. Something that is sort of my own opinion is that it doesn't always need to be super objective, super truthful. And I need to explain that because one thing in American education that I think is lacking, this is an example, is learning about Native Americans, these people who we stole their land and lied and cheated and killed to displace them. And we can learn about the Trail of Tears in elementary school, and we can continue to learn more about them through high school. But one of the things that stuck in my mind the most in my education that was the most powerful was actually surprisingly in a poetry course in college, where we read Joy Harjo, who is a 2-time U.S. Poet Laureate and also a Native American woman. And reading her poetry really didn't teach me, but allowed me to understand the Native American, or at least one Native American's perspective and really tradition and feelings more than just a history textbook ever could. And so I think just having a more multidisciplinary perspective is something that we should also implement when we're changing curriculum.
Oh, thanks so much, Will. Great point. Either Grace or Hyunyeol, do you want to go next? Grace.
So I think that my experience in high school in the public school system with the IB program, a lot of people say that the IB program is really tough. And I think that it's hard to get kids that young to decide whether or not they want to be in such a rigorous program without knowing the details about that program. It also is a thing about where you place those programs. So my program was placed in a very small public high school that didn't have a lot of budget. So they weren't able to offer the full variety of courses, which in that they offered IB History of the Americas, which is one of the ones that I took, but one that they weren't able to offer because of a lack of funding, lack of teachers, lack of interest, whatever it was IB Asian History. So there was that option if it had been offered to me at my school. So like with that, I think that in education, like I enjoyed the IB way of thinking is like, how do we know what we know? And like very much discussion based and like thinking about all the connections, like interdisciplinary thinking, which is incredibly important, especially when you're young, to like start thinking that way and then build upon that as you go to, you know, senior year, then you go to university, and then even as you get into the workforce, like you're always learning, like in this field, as I've been learning along the way through the programming, but like having choices when you're younger about what you want to do, it helps to make people more passionate about those things because they want to do those, like as Will was saying. You're passionate about what you do and you're gonna go do great things because you want to apply yourself.
Thank you. Hyunyeol?
I'll keep it short. That was a very difficult question for me because the thought that I had on Korean education originally was that, yes, it has its problems. Yes, it needs to be changed. Yes, it is centered towards college entrance exam. However, I don't believe in idealistic like sayings that we have to reinvent the education. We have to let the students like think outside of box and like not only think about the test. I don't really believe in that without changing the situation. And I am pessimistic of the situation being changed in a very short period of time, like, or to be honest, ever. So I think we have to like develop on that. It's not like Korean students do not get chances of like doing things or getting like some kind of like verified education outside of school. So I think those activities should be done outside of school, like I'm doing right now in this conference. So yes, that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry, but we are out of time for any more questions. However, we have a wonderful lunch reception and networking opportunity. So I do hope you will all take advantage of chatting with our students. Could all of the other students that are here that are part of our program raise your hand just so everyone knows who you are? So yeah. All right. Great. So first, I just want to thank everyone so much for being here today on this Saturday. Thankfully, we did not have the wintry mix that we thought we might, so it was not quite as dangerous to get here, but we are really, really grateful for you to all coming here and spending the day with us. I'd also really like to thank all of our panelists and moderator from the first panel, as well as our student panelists. So please, let's give our student panelists another round of applause. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank our supporters, the Korea Foundation USA and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Your generous support made it possible for us to be here today, for which we are eternally grateful. I lastly would like to just thank the ISC staff. We're an incredibly small team. Myself and Deborah, who I think is in the other room, our Program and Communications Associate. We could not have done this without her, and our two interns, Hanwol Jung and Chrislyn Massey. They're right outside those doors. They probably greeted you when you came in, but thank you so much for all of your support and working really, really, really hard over the past few weeks, even over the holidays, to make this happen. Lastly, I would just like to say that if you know any undergraduate or graduate students in your life who you think would be great additions for the Japan America Student Conference, the Korea America Student Conference, or the China America Student Conference. Please encourage them to visit our website and to apply. Actually, the Japan America Student Conference and the China America Student Conference have extended their deadlines. There's just, I think, 1 or 2 more days left. But if you know someone who might be interested, please share. Lastly, we have Japanese and Korean food for lunch. There's some sushi, some bulgogi. It's a mix, should be pretty delicious. So we hope you will stay and enjoy that. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.